Hello, humanoids. Are you in there? Welcome. It is Adam and Akbar. Can you believe it? This is our last lecture until we have a wrap-up lecture to conclude the semester. I hope you have enjoyed this class and you have learned a lot from it. Today, we're wrapping up our unit on science and policy with a talk on 3 theories of science and politics. So let's jump into it. Akbar, my goodness, we're not even ready here. Here we go. All right. Here's the outline for today and a note at the end here. So a few words about this module on science for policy. And then I want to give you 3 models or theories, I use those terms interchangeably, to understand the way science works in democratic decision making. And then the note I want to make at the end is if you go to your outline that I post, the Word document, I have put an outline there. I'm sorry, you go to your notes, the Word document I post for you on Canvas. I have an outline of the article that you have been assigned to read. I think it is super important, and I have read it a few times, and I took the time this time around to make a detailed outline of it in hopes that that helps you. So I'm not going to talk you through it because you get enough of me talking at you, but it's there as a resource for you. Okay. A few general remarks about this module, why it's important, a few reasons. Number one, it's stating the obvious, but it's worth stating that we rely on science to inform the decisions that we make. And so getting at this relationship between science and decision making is important because it is what's at stake is the reliability of our decisions when oftentimes people's lives or livelihoods are hanging in the balance. We also rely on science to legitimize our decisions, right? In a democracy, we tend to think of science as something that transcends partisan political differences. And therefore, if you can base a decision, if you can justify a decision on the basis of science, it has greater legitimacy, right? Something that everybody could buy into. At least that's the hope. And then, of course, there's this balance we've been talking about for a while now of simultaneously seeing science as a political activity, as something that is appropriately politicized in the sense of we need to have debates about which direction we should go. And science is a part of that. And science is inherently a social activity, and there's values decisions woven into it. And so we need to make sure that people are involved in those, and we don't just treat the experts as making political decisions without any oversight or accountability, right? That's on the one hand. On the other hand, we also have to shield science from politics. We can't allow politicians or people in power to substitute their own wishful thinking for the conclusions of science or the findings of science, or substitute whatever they want reality to be for the actual evidence that science finds. So that's a tough balance to strike. And in a way, that's kind of what the article you're going to read is all about. Okay, I got these 3 models for you, or theories, just to help us think about the role of science in political decision making. So that's the rest of this talk. I'll just go through each one briefly and talk a little bit about the pros and cons of each model. My job is not to tell you what to think about these or to argue that one is right and the others are wrong. It's just to kind of give you tools for thinking about situations that you're going to encounter for the rest of your lives as you think about science politics. Okay, here's the first one. In a way, the most simplistic one, the linear model, where in a way you just think about politics as applied science. And it's simply stated that there's some political problem or a decision needs to be made. You turn to the scientists and you say, tell us about this. The scientists produce knowledge. Everybody looks at the same set of facts, right? The same knowledge. And on the basis of that, they establish a political consensus about what we should do. And on the basis of that political consensus, we have wise policy action. There you go. That's the linear model, right? Do the science, get some knowledge. People can agree that, oh, yes, this is the actual knowledge, and then we all agree on which direction to go. Now, sometimes it works that way, you know, but often there's persistent controversy, gridlock, disagreement, even in the wake of growing scientific studies and knowledge. And so the other two models I'm going to spend more time on are really trying to answer the question, why is it that this linear model often doesn't work? I mean, sometimes it does, but often it seems like something breaks down. What's breaking down here? Okay, now first, so a few notes, a few words in defense of this linear model. Obviously, look, leaders have a responsibility to make decisions on empirical evidence. Science provides this sort of privileged insight into reality. So policymakers have an obligation to listen to and follow the science. And that's sort of what the linear model lays out for you. And I think there's more than a grain of truth to that. That's not all the truth, but there's certainly truth there. Like we said, with science legitimizing decisions in a pluralist, democratic, secular society, science is the arbiter of truth. And so the linear model putting science as the driving force for our decisions, again, that's an important aspect in defense of this theory. And it does make sense, at least for what I want to call tame problems, not wicked problems. But problems where it might be that, oh, just part A isn't communicating with part B, and we figure out why those parts aren't talking, and we apply the science and we solve the problem, right? This is my own thinking, but I don't know how many of you are Star Trek fans. It strikes me that in our politics, a little more Spock would be a good thing. A little more logic, and that's kind of what the linear model is all about. Look, just get the facts straight, and once we know the facts, then we'll know what to do, right? There's something to be said for that. And it really foregrounds in our balance here of shielding, enrolling science in society and shielding science from society. This foregrounds the importance of scientific independence. And it alerts us to the dangers of politicizing science. Look, all of these government agencies that we rely on, and of course, academic science, they've got to be autonomous in some important sense. They have to be free to speak truth to power, especially if it's an inconvenient truth that those in power may not want to hear. And the linear model really foregrounds this autonomy of science. Now, some critiques of it. Like I said, descriptively, it doesn't always work out that way. So it may not be a very good model just in terms of describing what actually goes on. Maybe ideally it is a good model. That's interesting to think about. But descriptively, it seems to not always work that way. Why is it? Well, maybe it's too simplistic. The linear model doesn't account for plurality in a couple of different ways. It doesn't count for the disagreements and the uncertainties built into science, because there's also often a lot of sciences in the plural, right? In those different studies or different disciplines can disagree with each other. And also, there's clearly disagreement in politics about the ends we should pursue and the best means to get to those ends. That's not really represented in that model very well. Furthermore, look, politics is just not applied science. It's not like baking a cake from a recipe. We're not making things when we do politics and we make decisions. It's not like we're making a bookshelf or something. Politics is about action, and action is about plurality, and plurality is about disagreements and different ways of seeing reality, and we just have to deal with that. Another problem with the linear model is it tends to promote the scientization of politics. So in emphasizing the autonomy of science, you might get experts making what are fundamentally values-based decisions under the guise of objective knowledge or objectivity. And that can be a problem because it can remove democratic accountability from decisions that are really impacting on people's lives, and where their voice would be just as credible as anybody else's because they're decisions about important values and not necessarily technical decisions. So the values and the technical stuff get tangled together, and we have to be careful about that tangle there. Plus, we may not always need more science to solve our problems or mitigate them. Arguably, I've been telling my climate change class, maybe we have too much climate science, or maybe it's becoming a problem. Okay. Plus, another Spock reference here. Okay. Logic is the beginning of wisdom, not the end. Again, politics is more than just getting the facts straight. Now, let's put the theory under question here in one slide. This bridge from science to knowledge, well, what about uncertainty that often exists? Experts disagreeing with each other. A condition that Hobbes called seeing double, or what we're going to call an excess of objectivity. Move down the linear model. Knowledge translating into political consensus. Well, that's always filtered through different media, different frames, and what our reading is talking about, maybe incommensurable epistemologies or different ways of knowing the world. At the point of political consensus, well, where's that? Right? That rarely comes about, right? Well, because there's these persistent factions, alternative stories, persistently different ways of framing reality. And then when it comes to wise policy action, I mean, that's often not cut and dried either. You have these multiple alternatives. I gave, for an example, in climate change, should we do nuclear or not, right? There's competing uh, visions about what the future should be. There's uncertainties about costs and benefits and future impacts. So there's so much complexity, in other words, that the linear model cannot capture. So let's do another one. Here's the second model, excess of objectivity. This comes from a book by Daniel Sarowitz that I have put in your notes for you if you want to follow up on it. His argument is that the linear model breaks down not because science fails to produce objective facts, but because it does so too well. Again, this is what Hobbes called seeing double, or what Sarowitz calls an excess of objectivity. In other words, science is really good at coming up with truths about reality. In fact, so good that there's too much of it. Okay, so everyone marshals the science to legitimize their positions, and because science produces uh, truths that both or all sides can use, you end up having powerful interests winning, just as they would have won whether science was involved or not. So here's a quote from his book: "The scientific view of nature is sufficiently rich and diverse to support a diversity of strongly held and often conflicting political interests and public values." Look, there's all these different kinds of sciences I listed here. And when you look at controversies like genetically modified organisms, for example, you'll find that the disagreeing sides both have their scientific studies to validate and support their position. Okay? Sarowitz is a geologist, a kind of field science. And what he's putting forward here is kind of a field science view, not a physics or a lab science view. That kind of physics, like we can control reality and come to one picture of it, that's a kind of lab science or physics-based science model. Sarowitz is saying, no, it's more like geology, where you're out in the field and you're reading the rocks, and you could come up with several different interpretations of what you're looking at, and they could all be grounded in the evidence, right? So there's this excess of objectivity. Now let's put this theory into its own model. So rather than a linear line going straight across, you have what Sarowitz in another publication calls the iron triangle. So start at the top. Politicians face a problem. I don't know, climate change, genetically modified organisms, you name it, right? Oh boy, they don't want to, they don't want to piss off any of their constituents if they can avoid it. So they say, look, let's see what the scientists say about it, because the scientists will tell us the truth, and everybody will have to agree on that, right? That's the only responsible thing to do. We said that in the linear model. What happens though? Here's the problem. Scientists produce this excess of objectivity. Okay. Now you have the advocates pushing the special interest groups, right? The lobbyists, the NGOs, all pushing the politicians for their preferred outcome. And they take this excess objectivity and they've got multiple views about what should happen. And group A says, look, science says we should do A. And group B says, look, the science says we should do B. And the politician says, oh, I don't know. And so the politician says, what does the science say? And we go back around here. And this is gridlock, right? So this is the way that model will explain persistent disagreement and gridlock around important science policy decisions, because science itself is producing sufficiently rich outcomes to justify different views of the world, and those views continue to come to loggerheads in politics. Okay, yeah, science says A and not A, right? So there's kind of this paradox going on. All right, wrap this one up here. Sarowitz has this quote here: the problem is not one of good science versus bad or sound science versus junk science. Rather, nature can be viewed through many lenses, right? And the resulting perspectives don't add up to one uniform image, right? Okay, that's his take on it. So what are the strengths of this theory? Well, it accounts for things the linear model misses, right? Especially the plurality of the sciences. We've said that. Maybe it offers a more realistic role for science. So, whereas the linear model sort of sets science up to provide us with objective facts and predictive certainty about what is and what is going to happen, maybe science has a more modest role. It can alert us to problem. Maybe what decision makers can do is associate the science with a range of policy alternatives. And then maybe the science can guide our action after we've already come up with a political consensus. But science itself is not going to give us that consensus, right? So this model highlights the importance of explicit values discussions and the dangers of scientizing politics, which again were built into the linear model. Weaknesses of the excess of objectivity model: false equivalency. Beware of that. Okay, so just because you can see a situation as A and not A doesn't mean that A and not A are equally valid or legitimate characterizations of the situation, right? So one example currently: who won the 2020 presidential election? Well, on one side, you have everybody who's saying President-elect Joe Biden. On the other side, you've got President Trump and his Twitter feed making all of these claims about how he actually won the election. Are those really equivalent, right? That's a problem, okay? So one of the problems with this model then is, what do we do about junk science, special interests, fake news, bad faith, or just bad arguments, okay? What our article will call epistemic trolls. We need another theory to account for that. And so let's take our third theory here, the merchants of doubt model. What's really going on, according to this theory, is not that science produces legitimately different pictures of reality. Science actually produces, eventually at least, one pretty steady picture of reality. The problem is powerful groups with a lot of money don't like that picture of reality. And so they flood the zone with a bunch of crap, with a bunch of doubt and disinformation to try to muddy up the waters so that we never actually arrive at a policy that would change the status quo, because those powerful interests are benefiting from the status quo. Okay, so what happens here? I'm going to give you the example from climate change, but you could apply this to different situations. You have the carbon industrial complex, so big oil, big coal, and the big money interests behind them. And the Heartland Institute, for example, has kind of the think tanks propping up this whole conglomeration of special interests benefiting from our present fossil fueled economy. Now, of course, in a way we all do, right? But they're most directly benefiting from it. Follow the linear model. Right away, they're going to say, let's see if we can't get our own scientists, right, on the fringes or on the margins, give them some money to produce their own scientific findings, right? Scientific in quotes, right? That if you're taking this model, this is junk science, right? It's not good. It hasn't been verified by the same way, but it's out there, right? And it sort of leads to doubt. I don't know. There's this study over here funded by the Koch brothers, right? Okay, so that's one thing they do. That tends to lead to, maybe we don't actually have knowledge, right? We're doing all this science, but I don't know, we keep having different outcomes and conclusions, so there's doubt and confusion. Okay. On this other part of the linear model, you have the creation of an alternative media universe. I don't know, this started probably with, well before talk radio, but you think about talk radio, you think about Fox News, and now you think about the internet and all the different platforms that are out there where people are getting their picture of reality mediated to them, right? And you have this doctrine of neutrality for traditional media, that if there's an issue, you have to cover what A said and what B said, even if B is not equivalent to A, right? So often you have these merchants of doubt taking advantage of that doctrine of neutrality and saying, no, you got to represent our voice too, even though it's a fringe voice. So now you have disagreement, okay, rather than political consensus. Then on the back end, in the politics, big money going into campaign contributions and lobbyists, so that the politicians are in the pockets of the people who are trying to control the narrative and the decisions. So rather than getting what might be a wiser outcome or a course of policy action, you just get the perpetuation of the status quo, because there's all this doubt and confusion and all this disagreement and all of these powerful interests that have all this influence. There you go, right? So that's the Merchants of Doubt model. Where am I getting this from? There's several books and articles out there. The one I put in your notes here is on the right side of the screen, Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's book, Merchants of Doubt, about the tobacco strategy and its application to climate change. Worth reading and thinking about. Okay, I'm gonna give you just one critique of that model, though, to think about. Whereas a problem with the excess of objectivity model was creating a false equivalency, you could say a problem with this model is that you risk creating a false binary, that you create this sort of dogmatic view of the good guys and the bad guys, the real science and the junk science. And you start policing this boundary in a way that leads to this sort of canceling of voices, silencing of even legitimate voices that don't fit into a clean ideological narrative about white hats and black hats, good guys and bad guys, right? Good and evil. This, in your article by Rausch, is a problem he's got with academia, frankly, and I do too, as well. I think he's right about this, that this model, it's got a lot going for it, but it can be pushed too far, and you can end up silencing and marginalizing voices to get some sort of ideological purity test, which really is contrary to the beating heart of science and a science-based society. So I'll give you just that critique to think about. Now, that's enough for me and Akbar. We've been yakking at you plenty. Again, check your notes for an outline for the reading. I hope it's helpful. I put a tweet here from President Trump because this article was written in 2018, but I'd like you to think about, again, what's going on with the 2020 election and the way you see President Trump reacting to it. And then think about that in terms of Rauch's characterization of this as troll epistemology. My hypothesis is that President Trump is taking this to a whole new level, right? It's the same dynamic, but he's really pushing it now. And I would also submit to you, I think this is incredibly dangerous. But those are my opinions. I can give you reasons for them if you want to chat with me. But for now, I'll leave you there. So enjoy that reading. I hope my outline is helpful. And until next time, may the force be with you.